This is the second episode of Weaponized Radio. If you don't wish to jam out with me, you can skip the song in the description. There'll be a timestamp.
Афганистан, кружит черный тюльпан над берегом реки. Афган, 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 Афганистан, кружит черный тюльпан над берегом реки.
Welcome back, everybody, to the second episode of Weaponized Radio. As always, I am Weaponized Goebbels, the guy who does the thing. You may know me, you may not. You probably do. I don't imagine anyone who doesn't follow me on Twitter is finding this. But if you do come from somewhere else, let me know. I want to understand how this whole reach thing works. I don't know how the algorithm functions, as you can tell from my pitiful subscriber amount. With me today, I have a good friend of not this show, but a good friend in the podcasting, my very limited podcasting career. You mind introducing yourself?
Hello everyone, I'm CSD. I run the Authenticity Telegram channel, and I do a lot of stuff on conservative anti-capitalism and nationalism, and along with other variety of stuff too.
Yeah, he's done quite a few things with me before. Back with Third Position Radio, he was on most episodes.
Almost every episode.
Yeah.
I have that habit of being on many podcasts where I'm on more podcasts than the actual co-hosts are at times, and I end up becoming the unofficial co-host.
Yeah, that happens. I don't know. I've lost track of how many podcasts I've been on, mostly because it's just been such a long period of time. I had no idea that, I'd hope I'd still be doing this, but I don't know. I thought we'd be already in a different world, but you know how it goes. Back when we all first found the distant right, the world was a lot nicer place, unless you're a newcomer. A lot of people switched over in 2020. I've seen that come from a lot of people, that 2020 was the year that they just broke with normal politics. Me, it was...
Yeah, 2020 was wild, man. We're almost coming up on 3 years on the anniversary of the death of George Floyd. That is crazy. Or did we just surpass the third year of his death?
I think we're already there. I remember the riot started in the summer. I don't remember the exact date.
I know it started in late May. I know that is for sure.
Yeah, well, that was, the turning point for a lot of people. And I don't, we're on YouTube, so I can't get into everything. But the left's proclivity to martyr scumbags has pushed a lot of people away from them.
Not to mention the whole support for the COVID-19 lockdowns has also caused many to turn against them, and the many debacles there have been over the Biden administration over the last 2 years.
Yeah, Biden has done such a wonderful job for me that I almost wish that he's gonna win the next one.
To be fair, though, despite how badly the pulling of troops out of Afghanistan was, it was about time that someone did it. And not to mention the CHIPS Act is pretty base, not gonna lie. So I'm not gonna pretend like everything is Biden has done is bad, but at the same time, it is clear that he is very incompetent. And that actually, I have a slightly different take than you, Goebbels, on this. I think the world has in some ways become a better place, because now it looks like America is finally having some more competition from the rest of the world, and that globalization as we know it is coming to an end.
Yes, we are entering a multipolar world. I've openly said, and people disagree with me on this, but I think that the war in Ukraine, which is our talking point today, was the end of the Pax Americana. I've said this before, and if you disagree with me, that's fine, but I think that's the end. There's going to be a lot more conflicts, because people now realize that America's not going to step in every single time.
I am in agreement, but where I slightly would say I disagree is that it is a matter if Russia wins this war, then this is definitely the end of Pax Americana. But at the same time, even with this war starting, we've already seen that major former U.S. allies like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the UAE just seem to have completely turned their backs on the United States and are now trying to get into economic alliances with Russia and China.
Yes,
and the same could be said with countries like Hungary too, which is just insane to think about now.
People are realizing that a one world power we're a little bit stretched thin, and not to mention, due to our political situation, we never have a consistent strategy. It's always, again, you know it's going to change every 4 years, maybe 8 years, but more likely 4 years, because even if someone does get reelected, their actions do change on their second term, because they now don't have to worry about re-election. I could see this whole system breaking down, and it is rough for some of these guys to keep American allies, because you got it, like I said, everything changes every 4 years. That's just so inconsistent. You can't do long-term planning when you're working with the United States because of that, simply.
Yes, I think another factor is especially with foreign policy, is that the United States has increasingly become dogmatic about who they ally it with and who they want their allies to be. Because if we look back at the Cold War, really, if you were just anti-Soviet and anti-communist, you could be an ally of the United States. It didn't matter if you were a liberal democracy, a social democracy, an authoritarian dictatorship, a Sunni Islamic monarchy. It didn't matter. But now, like, if you don't toe the line of neoliberalism, you're kind of just out of the club.
Yeah, back when I was a libertarian, when I was a young little kid still in high school, I believed in the dogmatic thing. I was like, why are we destroying these countries in the Middle East in the fight for freedom, big air quotes, fight for freedom, while also propping up worse regimes in other parts of the world? But now, looking at it, it's ridiculous that we're not. That's just practicality. People need to take this whole Wilsonian idea of making the world safe for democracy and throw that away, because that's not how geopolitics work. Again, proof's in the pudding. I said Wilsonian, Woodrow Wilson, every single peace deal he got his dumb fucking hands into made the world entirely prepped for World War II, because he set up literally every single fault of that treaty. Well, a few of them. No,
I mean, and honestly, it's like the United States hasn't learned since then. Just look at Russia after the Soviet Union collapsed, or Iraq. What is the one thing that all these 1930s Germany, 1990s Russia, and modern day Iraq have in common? They were in one form or another toppled by the United States government and had an extremely poor democracy where radical groups could foster and gain prevalence in them.
That's exactly the situation that led to the Weimar Republic. That's the situation that led to the rise of ISIS, because we kept knocking over these dictatorships and then leaving a power vacuum in these countries.
And what also gave rise to Vladimir Putin.
Oh, exactly. He's a direct response to America's actions.
So do you want to get into the actual situation on the ground in Ukraine right now?
I guess first I just want to go ahead and give a rundown for anyone who's not in the loop. I know if you're listening to this today, you're probably in the loop, but I don't know if you found this video 3 years, 4 years, 5 years in the future. I'm always finding old podcasts and, jumping in, and, the time difference really does change from, perspective and, references and memes. It is the year of our Lord, 2023. It is the 21st of May, while we're recording this. Russia invaded Ukraine about, you'd say a year and a half ago?
Yeah, a year and a half ago. The invasion started in February of 2022.
Yeah, and what the world thought for that first week was going to be a new world, a modern time blitzkrieg, like an Operation Desert Storm, but in the breadbasket of Europe, turned into a World War I slog that has really not changed. The front line really has not changed that much in that time frame.
Other than in a few small places like Bakhmut, recently.
Besides the first gains that pretty much were taken at the first days of the war, when Kiev was encircled, the first week. Now it's just along the Dnieper, including a lot of land that the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics have been holding for since 2014 for a while now. So really, the gains are quite minimal.
I have to admit, I kind of jumped on the hype a little too quickly. I thought this would be the first Gulf War where just Ukraine is obliterated. But I realize now that was extremely naive, just for two reasons. I think like the backing of NATO. I think a lot of people underestimated NATO just due to the fact that they got their asses kicked in Afghanistan. So they thought it would be like a cakewalk for Russia to steamroll into Ukraine. And I don't think a lot of people realize how much power NATO still has, even if it is in decline. And two, let's also be real here. There's a lot of like militias within Ukraine that are like radicals, radical nationalists, neo-Nazis. You know, even though that claim at times is a bit exaggerated by the Russian side, it is true that there are brigades that were founded by them. And any radical militant group that holds some radical ideology is going to be diehards, and they're going to put up like stiff resistance, regardless of what their ideals are.
Yeah, regardless of the tenableness of the front line, radicals are going to hold. That's their greatest ability, is their morale. Yeah, but a good chunk of the Ukrainian military are just levies from the actual just Ukrainian population. And
right.
It's just incredibly surprising how well they've held. And I'm alongside. I thought this was going to be a total recreation of the Gulf War. I thought Desert Storm was going to happen again, and Ukraine was going to be gone in 2 months, if even that. But that has not been what has happened. And my personal theory for this is a similar situation to World War I, where the mechanisms for fighting war have advanced beyond the tactics, because there's not too many conventional wars being fought out here nowadays. Mostly bushfire wars, insurgencies, little things. Yeah. Well, what happens with that is these countries and militaries who develop weapons, they have the technology far exceeds tactics, because you can't plan up tactics for a weapon you've never used. Plenty of people have, and they've always been ludicrous and ridiculous, because you're trying to predict something that you have no idea about. Again, same reason why everyone went into World War I thinking it was going to be like the Napoleonic Wars or the Franco-Prussian Wars, which it turned out to be not like remotely. And the same reason why when World War II broke out, the German Blitzkrieg just fucking decimated everyone in mainland Europe, because everyone was expecting a World War I situation. The means of fighting war have outpaced the tactics. And you see that a lot in the Russian-Ukrainian front. And I believe that's what happened.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. And I do definitely agree with you what you said a little earlier, though about like this being kind of like the Iran-Iraq war. I've seen some people try to compare it to the Soviet-Afghan war, which I see as just plain out wrong. I would say you're more accurate in saying that it's like the Iran-Iraq war, where it's kind of just become a stalemate between both sides at the moment.
It has. I think that's almost like the closest situation, because the Iran-Iraq war, the Iraqis got pretty far initially, but then were repelled to stalemate by the Iranians. I think that's the most apt one. Let's just hope that it doesn't end up with the same chemical weapon situation that they had.
I don't think either side would go that far. Maybe like some like tear gas or something like that, but not like actual like, what is it? What are some mustard gas or anything like that?
Yeah, there was I believe in the conflict they deployed not just regular chemical weapons, but also nerve gases, tabin, sarin. Of course, you have the mustard, cyanide, all the more basic stuff, but I believe some nerve agents were used in the conflict as well.
Right, I have seen some accusations from the Russian side that the Ukrainians had deployed like nerve gases or something like that, but I never heard it have been proven yet or not.
Yeah, I covered that a little bit in I think like a podcast, 2 podcasts ago. Back when I was still Third Position Radio. But we talked about that. I showed a video. I didn't show the video because it was on YouTube, and it was of what appeared to be a gas grenade being dropped on a Russian. But again, we can't be sure to know. I don't think the sides at the moment have any real need for a revenge terror weapon. Because the front's holding, the Ukrainians aren't in a desperate defense yet. Now, I can't blame them if they use chemical weapons if they start losing more. I mean, if someone invaded America, I would literally do anything to defend it, including chemical, radiological weapons. And so I can't blame them if they were to do that defending their country. However, I don't think the Russians have any real reason to do it. One of the main provocations for the war, one of the real reasons, ignoring all the dogma and things that people throw around, is the Ukrainian population, to incorporate a larger Slavic stock into the very much declining Russian population, to buy themselves some time, because much like China, Japan, and a lot of other countries, Russia is facing demographic collapse. And that's really the real reason why they're doing this. The whole NATO thing is just, it's a part of it, but that's more of like, the narrative spun.
Like, I think the NATO part is a lot more justified than saying that Ukraine is like controlled by actual neo-Nazis, which it's not. It may use like I was saying earlier, like some brigades that have neo-Nazi origins and still have members in them, but the state itself is not National Socialist. Like, Zelensky is ethnically Jewish. That is, why would he be like a National Socialist? Like, even like the Ukrainian insurgent army, I forget who the leader was of it. Like, while yes, it's true that they collaborated with the Nazis for a time, they even ended up turning on them and also fought the Soviet Union at the same time and like waged the guerrilla warfare into the 1950s. And if I'm not mistaken, why I can't remember his name right now, but he did have, like, the leader of the insurgent army did have like connections with the United States government.
People like to, at least people on the pro-Russian side, like to paint the entire country of Ukraine as Azov, and a lot of weird Westerners on the pro-Ukrainian side like to paint Putin as
Ukraine as a white nationalist bastion.
No, I'm talking about like the weird leftists who like it. Like, I mean, right, there's a lot of rightists who like to believe that, the Azov battalion is every single division in the entire war, which is just simply not true. And then you got the left talking about how it's like an LGBT haven. For whatever reason, that's their justification for liking it. I have not taken a side on this conflict, if you couldn't tell. I think that it's ridiculous. Neither of these sides serve my interest, so I do not side with either of them for ideological and practical reasons. And I think that a lot of people are just pulling straws because they want a Spanish Civil War to root over, which is just simply not the case.
Oh, you mean like trying to like make it like where it's like right-wingers versus left-wingers in Ukraine or something like that?
That's what every side's trying to paint it as, for the most part.
Yeah, like if you just look at on the ground level, I don't think that is the case at all. I mean, like, if you're making it like as it's the liberal world versus the illiberal world, despite like at times Ukraine using illiberal groups, Ukraine is definitely on the liberal side of things, and Russia is definitely on the illiberal side of things. Is that still fair to say?
I would agree that Ukraine is far more Western in the modern sense of, like, Western European style. It's still a post-Soviet shithole. Yeah, I will call that openly. It's still a shitty second world country, and without all the funding that NATO has given it, it would have already lost. But I would say that, yeah, I'm not going to call them liberal. Most Ukrainian peasants are probably not going to...
I mean, like, as in the government. Like, would that be, like, a fair assessment, though? Like, in the grand geopolitical scheme of things, is that, like, a fair assessment to you?
By the definition of it being a international capitalist state, I would agree that Ukraine would be in the liberal side of the world.
Like, yeah, not to mention, like, if you look at, like, some of the deals that are being made right now, like, it looks like BlackRock and, like, is planning to do business in the country if Ukraine wins, which it means that Ukraine is already giving up its sovereignty no matter what at this point.
True.
It's just trading out one evil for another. Not to mention, being on the side of George Soros, one of the main corporate backers of globalization across the world is never a good sign.
No, it really is a deal with the devil. I have hope that during this time that a nationalist fervor in the people of Ukraine would build up, where something like that and not wartime would be seen as reprehensible. But who knows? It could just be fed to them as something good. Because wars like this are very good for creating a national identity that previously I can't say existed as much before the beginning of the conflict.
But at the same time, we also see, like, there's also another form of nationalism in Ukraine. So, like, it's actually, we could say it's a variety of different forms of Russian nationalism, like Soviet nationalism. People who have nostalgia for, like, the Tsar, the Russian monarchy. And of course, this more I want to say more modern nationalism that has come under Vladimir Putin. Because if you look at the sides that like fight in Donetsk and Lugansk, like when it comes to the separatists, it's like it's like a mixture of all of everything that I mentioned, along with some other stuff too, like Nazbols or like, and even some like NS groups too.
Yeah, no, I've noticed that with again, they're both people's republics, but they have the Imperial Eagle on it. It's a very interesting mixture of identities from the Russian history, which it makes sense for people to cling on to. Modern, not to dog too much on Russia, but modern Russia is a bit of a bastard compared to its glorious history. And I can see there being a lot of nostalgia for the times where they were a more significant part of culture.
And I think what it also represents to a lot of these people is like a victory in Ukraine is a return to this glory, the glory of Russia.
It's definitely interesting. It's hard to put it on like I said earlier. Yes, Ukraine is a neoliberal state, but this cultural phase that the two countries are going through is quite unique. This mixture of left and right nationalism. Not saying it's never existed before, but I mean, in the modern day, it's a quite unique situation.
It is very unique, but this did not just start with the Ukrainian war, I might add. This started in the 1990s during Boris Yeltsin, where a bunch of different groups ranging from communists, monarchists, varieties of different socialists and nationalists banded together in opposition to Yeltsin, which, mind you, Russia back in the 90s was a lot worse than compared to it is now. And was a lot more on the Western side of things and neoliberal side of things, and in which, of course, caused like a lot of inflation, poverty, and a lot of other economic problems for the average Russian, which led a lot of them to different varieties of radical politics, with all of them being some form of anti-capitalism and nationalism.
Yes, I think that Russia is a breeding ground right now for new ideas. Not saying that they have like they're not the old Russia that produced amazing works like War and Peace and other things, like talking about cultural landmarks, but I believe the people going through this weird stage, because they've, within a time frame that most people in Russia have lived through, they've gone from a communist one-party state to a republic, like, a few caveats on that, to a bit more of a, I don't know what to call it. Like, I know people throw around oligarch a lot, but a modern oligarchy. Not to say that's a rare thing. Most countries are oligarchies. But they've really run the gambit on the experience of someone living somewhere. And I see very interesting things coming from that politically.
Right, of course. And as I understand it, as many of these, like, since we're talking about, like, Russia being this bastion of, like, I guess would you say of like radical conservative politics? Would that be like fair? Because like the big one that I remember that is from Russia that I know of is like Alexander Dugin, and his political theory is a form of conservatism from what I can understand of it. Mm-hmm. But what I'm trying to get at here is that what Dugin says about Vladimir Putin is he believes he's a transitionary figure. He's in between the liberal Russia and the non-liberal Russia, and and recently Dugin came out with an article on Geopolitica about like how Putin's successor is probably going to be a lot more illiberal than Putin was, and he's going to complete the transition away from liberalism in Russia.
I would say I believe that. I don't know if I have the fourth political theory. I don't know if I already own it. I have so many books, and I'm still setting up my office.
I was just going to say I've read For Political Theory. I've read a lot of Dugin's major works, like Putin versus Putin, the Eurasian Mission, the Theory of Multipolarity, the War of the Worlds, and a bunch of his minor articles that he's posting on like Geopolitica.
Yeah, I think that Dugin's going to be he's definitely going to be a figure in the history books. I don't know if that's a crazy position to take.
That is not a crazy position. There's probably already a history book about him at this point.
Yes, I believe that he is going to be a significant Russian not philosopher, but sociopolitic, person that people will talk about.
Oh, he is a philosopher and a political theorist. I mean,
yeah.
That's not an extreme thing to say either.
Okay, well,
but
He will be a major one that is alive today. And I think that his ideas will influence Russia going forward, because it's that or Russia dies, I'm gonna be honest. They are, like I said earlier, verge of democratic collapse. There's gonna have to be a major change in the Eastern Europe to continue being Eastern Europe.
I definitely agree with that. I would say also, though, that Dugin is probably the most influential anti-liberal philosopher of our age and time, and I don't think anyone is as more important as he is at the moment. By no means perfect, and but nevertheless, and whether people like it or not, he is definitely the most influential.
Yes, and I think that will all his words
that will continue if Russia wins.
Yes, that's what I was going to get to. His words aren't going to suddenly change because Russia wins, but they will have more value. People will take them more seriously. I believe that this idea could be exported to the West and other parts of the world if Russia succeeds. But if Russia does not succeed in the annexation of Ukraine, I believe that his words will remain in Russia. Well, at least not his words. We already have the books here, but I mean, in practice, only in Russia.
Yeah. And I think at that point, the whole polar project is in jeopardy if Russia loses.
Yeah.
But we already see that his words are already we already see countries countries leaders like Xi Jinping in China, Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, and even now Assad, Syria. I know they're all a part of the Russian camp, but the fact that they're all talking about multipolarity, which, let's just be real here, Dugin is the main theoretical and geopolitical theoretician that advocates for that. The fact that that's already spreading to many different countries and that term is being thrown around a lot now is already proof enough that his ideas have gone global.
I mean, yeah, but I just mean ideas can go global, but action is a different matter. Plenty of works have spread around the world and have been tossed around by armchair historians and college professors, but not all of them become action, physical force in reality. And that's what I'm referring to.
Right, but I would say that they do have a lot more influence now amongst countries' leaders than they did, back in the day. Because I think it's like we said earlier in this podcast, whether we like it or not, the Ukraine war is the beginning of multipolarity, and countries have to either adapt to this or die. And it looks like America is really trying to keep the unipolar world without realizing that it may be time to change strategy.
Yeah, I do see that quite a bit. I guess that really all depends, not just on Ukraine as well, but if...
China?
Yes, China. I believe if a third world war were to break out, multipolarity could be extended depending on the victor. But if not, I believe that it would probably die a slow death, no matter what happens.
Of course, and also if we see a victory in Ukraine, or even if this conflict is prolonged, the West could be distracted to such a point that China could easily walk into Taiwan. That could be a possibility. Because the United States, despite its wealth and power, cannot defend both countries all at once, since they're so far apart, and since both would would cost billions of dollars worth of resources.
True. I'm gonna be honest here, Chief. I'm surprised we're not already in a war. I mean, obviously there's minor conflicts around the world all the time that United States forces are intervening in. What I'm referring to is a major war, and I'm talking entirely for political reasons. It's a known fact that every single president who started a war in their first term gets reelected. That is a absolute fact. And I think the Biden administration, if they were thinking about the longevity of his reign, would probably be considering that, because unless Trump runs independent, dividing the conservative vote, I don't think there's any physical way for Biden to get a second term.
Yeah, I really hope he does run independent. The Republican Party needs to fucking die, but not for the reasons that liberals want it to die. But the simple fact is that the Republican Party, it in its ideology is such a strain on a hindrance to social conservatism, the idea of fusionism, free market capitalism, and how detrimental that has been to cultural conservatism. The Republican Party, if it will not turn into something else, it deserves to die, and social conservatives should go find somewhere else or some other organization to represent their interests.
Yes, it does need to die. I agree. I'm gonna go ahead and say that I think the Republican Party has done more to harm conservatism in America than the Democrats have.
Because let's just face it, Reagan economics was the acceleration of economic globalization, not to mention mass immigration, and arguably was a predecessor to many of the free trade agreements that were passed in the 1990s, like NAFTA.
Yes, it doesn't benefit any American citizen besides certain groups who own everything. Like 5 corporations literally own everything.
Yeah. Like the corporate and banking classes.
Yeah, basically, it doesn't. These things do not benefit a single other person. But again, back to Ukraine. Although America isn't a major part of this, and although I bet sure Ukrainians are thinking that's absurd. This is our war. It is, but much like the Spanish Civil War or any other war between. A proxy war between different factions during global tensions, it really always comes down to the internal story of the countries fighting them, like funding them, fighting them for whatever reason. It always plays back to that because that's what geopolitics is.
Yeah, exactly.
But anyway, Ukraine, stagnation, frontline basically on the Dnieper and not too many other places. I don't know that much about the Battle of Bakhmut. Is that correct? So
yes, it is the Battle of Bakhmut.
You're my subject matter expert on that. So just lay it out for everyone who doesn't know.
All right. So recently, the Wagner Group, which is a private Russian paramilitary organization, has its leader, who name kind of escapes me at the moment, has claimed that most of the city, actually not most, the entire city is under Russian control. The Ukrainian government has denied this and said that they're in control parts of it still. However, I think it is probably true that the vast majority of the city is under Russian control, and there's only some minor fighting. I shouldn't say minor, but there is still some fighting on the outskirts. So I wouldn't say the battle is over just yet, but it wouldn't surprise me that it will be a Russian victory.
Yes, I think that Ukraine has to say that it hasn't been won, hasn't been lost to them, simply because at least their narrative was that this was their, no pasaram, that this was going to be the stopping point, and it appears that is not the case.
Yeah, not to mention there's been a lot of weird contradictions from the Ukrainian side, where it's oh, this is the start of our new grand offensive. Oh no, this is not. And since they've only made some minor successes on the outskirts of Ukraine, the outskirts of Bakhmut and all, but the Russians have nevertheless still captured the vast majority of the city. I think that whole narrative is a complete flop at this point. Maybe it's it's manipulation to get the Russian side confused, but I'm not too sure really what is going on when it comes to all those contradictions.
From what I've heard, I know people who know people in Russia. I believe the Russian forces believe that there is a counterattack coming, and because of that, they're calling up a lot of reserves, not all the way straight to the front line, but they are conducting a lot of military training drills, refamiliarizing prior, the levies that they have, redoing training drills across the entire country in preparation to send more men to the front if there is a offensive, which, again, from what their actions say, they believe also will occur, but has yet to occur.
Yeah, it's yet to occur. At least a major offensive has yet to occur. Honestly, at this point, it seems like, from what I can tell, both sides have just become a stalemate. And from what I can see from the Ukrainian side, they still want more equipment from the United States before they launch that set of equipment. So to me, it's it's either becoming either A, this is the truth, or B, that this counteroffensive is just never going to happen because Ukraine is too, the morale in Ukraine is just too low.
Well, I don't know if morale would be the issue. I think it would be an issue of manpower. While
That is also true too.
while Russia hasn't even like totally mobilized, like apart from like what the media says, they're not like pulling every fighting age man off the streets and taking them to the front line. That simply hasn't occurred yet.
They're not even majorly like redeploying forces away from Syria or like from the African nations that they're involved in either.
Yeah, like they still have a lot of forces doing a lot of different things. It hasn't become a great desperate defense. But the opposite is not true for Ukraine. Ukraine has levied everyone they can. I know there's plenty of international brigades there as well, but as of right now, Ukraine has, if we're talking about like, you know, some fucking nerdy Hearts of Iron references, they're scraping the bottom of the barrel. And with a nation so much smaller, you can only really do that for so long.
Yeah, and that leads to the question: how much longer will this war last? And until like Zelensky has to call it, you know, quits and calls Putin and say, "Hey, look, we're ready for negotiating now." Like because the last times they tried to negotiate, Ukraine would barely concede anything to the Russians, and that's why the talks just completely collapsed. And if Russia like scores several major victories here, and like the morale and manpower in the United States just realizes that, oh, Ukraine cannot win, then I think it is possible we could see China be able to mediate that between the two sides, which, if it does successfully, like it's doing it with Iran and Saudi Arabia, then this century will not be the American century like so many neoconservatives thought it would be, but it will be the Chinese century. And not to mention, if they do that with Ukraine and Russia, that will be the first time a non-European country has mediated between European countries.
I don't totally know if that would be the situation, entirely because of maybe China would make more sense to mediate because their lack of involvement. Because despite the way people like to paint the world, and even though Russians and Chinese are roughly, you know, in the same camp, they're not traditional allies. The Sino-Soviet split happened a long time ago, and the reasons for that split have not changed. They simply just happen to have the same enemy. I don't see...
I think in the long term you're correct, but we have to remember China's already tried to mediate between the two sides and drew out a map and everything on where Ukraine would concede stuff and a bunch of other like ideas and a bunch of other demands that both sides would have to like agree upon. That's why I said China. Like, not to mention China has been playing this mediating role for a while now between different sides.
That's fair. I don't know. I feel, and I could be totally wrong on this, again, you know, I can't predict the future, but I feel like with how Ukraine how they've responded to talks of mediation, I don't believe they would be open to mediation until Russia had won so many victories that the Russians would see no reason to mediate because they could still get more territory by pushing forward. At least that's the way that I can see things going.
Yeah, I could see that being possible too.
Because as of right now, they want everything back, including Crimea. Yeah, despite the fact that the Russians have owned that, you know, since Obama was in office. You know, that's before a lot of people who are now picking sides in this conflict were even born.
Even aware of the conflict. Or could even point to Ukraine on a map.
Well, first off, most people taking a side in this conflict didn't even know where Ukraine was before the conflict.
Obviously, at that time, like in 2014, I was like in fucking middle school, but I've been well aware of the conflict in Ukraine since like 2018, 2019. 2018. So I've been trying to follow this for some time now. It's kind of like what we're saying about, you know, to go back a little bit ways on this podcast and what we were saying about Taiwan. Like we all knew it was going to like eventually a major war was going to break out there. It's just a matter of when rather than if.
Yeah, that is true. It is still a matter of when for that as well. And again, I know that a lot of people disagree with me because I am a total fucking warmonger, and I want World War III so fucking bad. I pray for it every single night.
I don't want World War III. I don't want it. Like honestly, like if I had it my way, I would just like hope that like the neoliberal order would just slowly collapse like the Soviet Union did, and we'd avoid a major conflict where millions of people would be killed.
That's one thing that I guess a lot of people didn't predict, because typically when systems are collapsing, there's always this last hurrah, this last the system simply trying to prove that it still exists, and that can occur in a lot of different violent means. But you didn't see that in the Soviet Union, excluding that coup that happened with Khrushchev.
Gorbachev.
Gorbachev. Of course, fucking not Khrushchev. Jesus.
Well, Khrushchev did get couped too. That is true.
Yeah, that happened a few times. Why the hell did I think it was Nikita Khrushchev? I need to refresh my history.
Because both Gorbachev and Khrushchev were kind of liberal, and they both got couped or attempted coup against them.
Well, yeah, but like, Khrushchev. Yeah, Khrushchev himself came to power with a coup d'état, because more than likely it was going to actually be Beria succeeding Stalin after his death. Before we continue on with that, we're going to go ahead and start our little break. We're going to play a little song, and we'll be right back with you in a moment.
Ровный бег моей судьбы, ночь, печаль и блеск души, лунный свет и майский дождь в небесах.
welcome back from that little break. I'm gonna pretend that I already knew which song I was going to play for you and make a witty comment about it, and use that as a jump-off point to continue the conversation. But when I make this shit, I typically choose the songs afterwards, so just pretend it was witty and comedic, and let's get back to the podcast.
So you want to move on to since we briefly spoke of the mediation that China's been trying to do with Ukraine. You want to talk about what's going on in or what happened with Saudi Arabia and Iran, and how China has basically mediated peace between the two, and how quickly the geopolitical situation is changing in the Middle East?
That is it's so weird how little I've seen about that, and that's like a really big fucking deal. So yeah, we should talk about that.
Even at the start, I guess we could even go as far back as 2021. It was already clear that the Sunni powers, whether that be Turkey, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and others, were already turning against the United States, not necessarily becoming direct enemies, but were already breaking with United States geopolitical goals. Because if you remember, in 2021, I believe the United Arab Emirates was one of the first countries to re-normalize relations with Syria, even after it cut off ties, helped expel it from the Arab League, and even fund the militants in the region. Then in 2022, with the start of the Russian-Ukraine war, we saw that neither Turkey or any of the other Sunni powers, who are traditionally, to remind all of you, were American allies throughout the Cold War, had not sanctioned Russia. Many times they didn't even condemn Russia in the EU. Not the EU, the United Nations. And in the case of Saudi Arabia, they cut oil production in OPEC even after the United States told them not to, which was at the benefit of Russia. And mind you, that at the start of the war, the U.S. was having soaring, and other European countries are having soaring gas prices, in which I believe is still happening in Europe as of right now.
Yes, I think that really comes down, again, this is a modern thing. Of course, you mentioned this is that's been going on for a while, but it just comes down to how toothless a few of our administrations have been. I know a lot of people like to praise Trump, but even though I can't say that I thought his presidency I don't think it wasn't that bad up to the pandemic. After that, it was garbage. But but a lot of these presidents, including Trump, have been rather toothless when it comes to our allies, quote unquote. We don't have the strong arm that we used to have.
It's not only that they're toothless. I wouldn't say it's because they're toothless, but I would also say another factor. Actually, if we were to talk about Trump, before I get into that, if we were to talk about Trump for a minute, it was already clear that the United States wanted to get out of the Middle East. That's been something that a lot of people, including within the ruling class, have been wanting to do for some time. Despite the major hiccups that Trump did to accelerate the war in the Middle East, like the assassination of General Soleimani and the airstrikes in Syria, Trump was already making plans to have Saudi Arabia and the UAE become to protect Israel and all that. So it's obvious that the UAE and Saudi Arabia were going to either way try to become buddy with Russia and China, because they're a lot closer to them than the United States is, and have had a lot more and have had a more traditional role in the Middle East compared to the United States.
Yes.
But the crazy part about this deal with Iran and China is that alliance that Trump tried to make between the Sunni powers and Israel, with the exception of Turkey for the most part, has completely collapsed. Because I don't know if you've been seeing the news recently, but Saudi Arabia has been recently renegotiating with Hamas, Hezbollah, groups that have been very antagonistic to the state of Israel, to the point where they believe that Israel has no legitimacy.
I mean, to be fair,
Iran believes that too. So,
well, I'm about to say, to be honest, before and during the time that Saudi Arabia was pretty buddy with America, they're always secretly funding these. But now they're being more open with it, it does show a changing tide.
Right, and the only reason why they would not fund or support groups like Hezbollah was because it was a pro-Iranian group. And let's be honest, that's the only reason why they ended up lining up on Israel, because let's remember, Saudi Arabia is like Iran, still doesn't recognize Israel as a country.
Understandable.
And they have been very much on the side of the Palestinians, along with the UAE, on the side of the Palestinians. In fact, recently, the UAE decided not to do a trading deal with Israel just due to how the Israelis have been acting with the Palestinians recently. And Saudi Arabia has also like brought an Israel delegation to the country that was going to be like for some like UN tourism convention or something like that, which is very interesting.
I think it's these countries, like, for the first time in a while, actually acting in their own interest. Now, their involvement in the Gulf War was acting in their own interest, because if they said no, we would have fucking invaded them too.
Yeah.
But now they're actually acting in their actual interest. No Arab country has...
Saddam was kind of a rogue element.
He was a bit. But no, realistically, no Arab nation has anything to benefit from the continuation of the State of Israel. They don't.
Or having continued relations with the United States, because if you look, like, I don't know if you've seen my article I wrote on my blog, but if you look at like the Arab Spring, like how like the major like mass protests that were so many times supported by the United States, even went into countries that are traditionally a part of the American like alliance in the Middle East, such as like Saudi Arabia and Bahrain
and Egypt, yeah, majorly in Egypt as well, despite the fact Egypt being an American ally for like the longest time in the region.
Yeah, and if you look at like groups like the like all these NGOs, like the National Republican Institute, I believe that's what it's called, in the internet. Or I should actually look up the names first. Hold on, just to give me a second.
Well, while you're doing that, I happen to know people I have a few connections with people who've served, and yeah, we've had I know people who've like been stationed, done tours, training exercises in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, that whole area, and us funding these rebels for regimes that were already on our side. The major one that occurred during the upheaval in Egypt was the Muslim Brotherhood, who managed to snag power briefly before being overthrown by the military junta, who still rules the country. Siding with America, or even just interacting with America, sometimes, depending on the presidency, will just lead to you being killed. The same reason why Gaddafi was murdered, because he decided to stop going up against the West, only to be murdered for it. A lot of these countries do not benefit from this.
The International Republican Institute, that's what I was talking about, which is an NGO that's not only funded by the United States government, but many of our favorite corporations and foundations, such as the Open Society Foundation, Amazon, Coca-Cola, you name it. But yeah, it was already clear even back then that the United States, while it did at times technically support both sides in those conflicts when it comes to like the countries that were traditionally a part of the American alliance, but at the same time, if they were overthrown, they wouldn't care either. Not to mention, in the long run, with America's idea of spreading liberal democracy and globalism around the world, these countries just simply don't have a place in that in the long run. And let's just be real, under the Biden administration, where he and the American establishment have increasingly become critical of these countries, like not only being absolute monarchies, but also for their views on homosexuality too. Which, let's be honest here, the Middle East is one of the staunchest places where homosexuality is like just completely condemned. So trying to like force that on them is obviously going to cause some problems.
Well, yeah, I don't see how, I don't understand why we think that's ever a good idea. Like, the democracy didn't work when we enforced it in the region. Let's fucking throw every other Western concept. And let's be honest here, that is a Western concept.
Yeah, because you don't see Russia or China promote that. And even themselves are very hostile to it.
But we don't see a lot of our allies promote that in the same way. I'm not to say Japan's a pillar of conservatism, but despite how degenerate the media that comes out of Japan, a lot of them still aren't as okay with transgenderdom, homosexuality, as we would want them to be. Same thing with India, another American ally. These are Western concepts, and most leftoids don't realize that it's I'm not gonna say cultural imperialism, because then I run the risk of sounding like a but it really is, you know? It is a Western concept being forced onto these countries, which forcing an idea on a country isn't always a bad thing. I mean, the West is a reason why slavery, for the most part, has been eliminated in the Middle East and Africa.
But when it's completely antithetical to these people's way of life to such a point, not to mention, let's just be real here. In the grand scheme of things, like, LGBT rights does not grow the population. It serves no interest other than maybe like as a consumer group.
That's what it is. It's a consumer group. So again, back to the Middle East. We're, like you were saying, we're moving very rapidly to a multipolar system. And I think the Middle East is a good blueprint on how that could go. But personally, I don't see a return to Pan-Arabism, if that's what you are implying by that.
I don't necessarily mean in the traditional sense of Pan-Arabism, like Baathism or Nazarism, but we have to remember the Arab League exists, you know. And one of the things which also that's another thing too, something we forgot to bring up. Syria is back in the Arab League now,
I was unaware.
Yeah, and Assad recently had a speech there saying talking about like multipolar world and how the Arab world should act in that interest, in part being a part of the Arab world and be united. You know, it's not going to be like, you know, what like Saddam or what Ba'ath Syria is now, but it's going to be like it's the Arab world as well as the surrounding Muslim world looks a lot more united now than it was, you know, 10, 20 years ago. And it will continue to do so as long as like negotiations hold up, which seems like they're holding up pretty well because it seems like every side is kind of negotiating with one another now, along with like not only just Syria being let back into the Arab League, but also like the Iran, Saudi Arabia, and UAE all reopening, their embassies in these countries and wanting to sign economic deals. Turkey's also, which isn't an Arab country, mind you, but is in negotiations with Syria at the moment to pull out of the country. And even Iraq, which, was for the most part, became like an American proxy state, is now de-dollarizing. And not to mention has Iranian-backed groups in the region that are like a part of the government of Iraq.
So when it comes down to that, first off, de-dollarizing, always a good thing. However, as you've seen many times repeated, to infinity, de-dollarizing is practically, giving America a war goal on your country. But I don't think we'll go back to the Middle East as things stand. Not to say we've really totally left. We still have troops in Syria and Iraq.
Yeah, not to mention Israel still exists. So let's just be real here. Israel would not exist without the United States.
No, it wouldn't. It just simply could not exist.
And if this current trend continues where the United States continues to lose more influence in the United States, which will therefore mean Israel lose influence, we could see the destruction of Israel sometime this decade. That is a possibility now. Not to mention there's all this infighting going on within the Israeli government right now due to Netanyahu, Benjamin Netanyahu, was trying to undermine the Supreme Court and give himself more power in the region, which caused mass protests throughout the country. Not to mention recent conflicts they've had with many Palestinian groups like the Palestinian Islamic Jihad.
Yes, I think that was a scrapped talking point from a previous podcast episode. How just the power struggle, weakening Israel from the inside, has been going on for a minute. We were a few episodes ago, we were making fun of the British for having 3 prime ministers in a year's time. It's like an overdrive in Israel,
and it's dealing with pressure from the inside and outside.
Yes, unlike the United Kingdom, which is first off on an island, instantly a stabilizing factor, but also in
it's surrounded by NATO countries.
Yeah, surrounded by NATO countries in Europe until the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, the most peaceful continent, and probably still the most peaceful continent if you don't really consider the Slavic part of it. But
or maybe North America if you're not counting Mexico.
Okay, fair. Well, if you're not, but you got to count Mexico. There's only 3 countries in North America.
Maybe Australia then. Maybe Australia.
I mean,
But it's one country. Okay, you know what? Let's stop arguing about it. It's dumb.
Yeah, you're right. But yeah, Britain can have these things happen because they simply have no outside pressure that would destroy them if they were internally divided. They can be as dysfunctional as possible, and they will suffer no consequences from an outside force outside of the things going on inside the country. Israel, it does not have that luxury.
It's either going to be civil war or invasion, or both, that ends up killing Israel in the end, which will mark the complete death of the United States' influence in the Middle East. And that is if Turkey also leaves NATO, which I think is possible now.
I don't totally know. Like, I know they've been recently cozying up to the Russians. However, I think Turkey has far more to gain from being in NATO than not being in NATO, simply because its proximity to Russia. It's just a good way to, prevent something fucky happening.
I don't know if I agree with that. I mean, I think as of right now, that may be, true, but if we're looking at, because we have to remember, Turkey is also, under Erdogan going in a more Islamic direction. And, we have to also remember the United States is also, cut out, Hungary and Turkey from their recent summit, their democracy summit, which obviously pissed those two countries off. So in the long run, I think they're going to have to switch camps. But once the United States is out of the way, I do believe that Turkey is going to go in its own direction. I think it has its own ambitions in the end.
I guess that really all depends. Back to the situation in Ukraine, depending on which way it goes. Either there will be a strong American ally in the Black Sea, or just Russia. So that really all depends on the current situation.
But in the Middle East, the countries that actually make up the Middle East, if Israel is completely destroyed, then that is definitely the death nail in America's power in the Middle East. If that does happen,
the nearest allies we would have would be Greece on one side and India on the other.
Yeah, and Turkey if they stay in, but let's remind everyone they're not technically part of the Middle East.
True, but they are
they are a major player in it.
A very major Islamic player, and an Islamic player who does not benefit from their neighbors being destabilized and spilling terrorism over into their border.
Also, that's another. Well, that actually brings up an interesting point too. Another reason why I would think that Turkey would eventually break is as long as the United States continues to back the Kurdish rebels, who also commit terrorist attacks in Turkey and claim parts of Turkey as their own, that'll continue to create strife between Turkey and the rest of NATO.
I understand being upset with that. Your allies literally funding, rebel groups in your country. That's not an ally. You have nothing to gain from associating with them. And
that's why I have a lot of hope for Turkey in the long run to leave. But that depends if Erdogan stays in, because his rival, despite being also claiming to be a nationalist too, is also a lot more liberal and wants to get closer to NATO. But since the last election ended in a stalemate, with the only other third party being a nationalist party that is in alliance with Erdogan's party, I think Erdogan has this in the bag, which the new round of elections are starting on May 28th, for those who don't know.
Yes, I guess it really does depend on that, because from what I've heard, despite what Turks say online, Erdogan has been losing a bit of popularity due to economic reasons.
Yeah, I'm not going to pretend Erdogan's perfect. Let's be real, he did commission the taking over parts of Syria. He's backed rebels in the region, still does. But if we're comparing him to other people, it could be a lot worse.
True.
Yeah. Is there anything else you want to talk about, or you want to start wrapping this up?
Did you hear about Greater Idaho?
Oh, about those Oregon counties wanting to secede into Idaho, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard about it. Has it gone somewhere recently?
Oh no, I've just been seeing a lot more actual people and local counties running little votes to see how interested they would be in the subject.
That is interesting. We have seen a lot more, I guess, what we'd say state nationalisms pop up recently in the last couple of years, because even in Texas, the Republican Party adopted a platform wanting us to vote on whether we'd support Texas secession from the Union.
Yeah.
Which I would never see in my lifetime.
Yes, there's been a lot more state nationalism popping up within America as we grow more and more divided. Naturally, the country folks of most liberal states who have no real power because the cities simply outvote them by their numbers and enforce their insane and unreasonable laws upon them, are very interested, in the case of Idaho anyway, breaking away from Oregon, I believe some parts of Washington, I cannot remember, and joining Idaho. And I can't blame them. I've been in both states, and Idaho is far preferable to Oregon.
Yeah, not to mention, isn't Idaho mostly rural, and these like counties that want to join Idaho are also mostly rural? So
Yes.
that also makes sense too, because rural counties are naturally conservative strongholds.
Well, yes, and it doesn't make any sense for them to want to be associated with Oregon. You know who determines how they live their lives in Oregon? Portland, the one of the cities in this nation that I would not shed a single tear if it was struck by a rogue ICBM, and I think many Americans hold the same sentiment.
Yeah, like Portland is one of the most liberal cities in like the whole country. Like they even, if I'm not mistaken, they were the reason why like they passed like a bunch of laws in Oregon where a lot of hardcore drugs were not illegal anymore.
Yeah,
decriminalized. Decriminalized. I don't know why I forgot that word. And it's not to mention the city is also, along with Seattle, is like one of the two major hotbeds for Antifa and anarchist activity.
But yeah, these I don't know. Is there a single city on the West Coast that can be saved?
Maybe after liberalism, but within liberalism, no. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, but within the current state that the world is in.
The current state, no, absolutely not. But at the same time, I have to criticize the conservative notion of constantly retreating too, because we have to face it, cities are center points of power, and whether we like it or not, for any, dissident right, conservative, whatever wants it to have power, it needs to gain power in the cities, and that means maintaining or taking control of cities that are like states that where conservatives have like control in.
Well, I mean, I believe that is a good method to do. Go in there, spread the word, but there are just some, like, you could do that in, like, the Midwest, Kansas, Missouri, places like that, typically blue cities, you can go in there and outvote them for smaller cities.
Right.
But not the West Coast. There is no way to get enough conservatives in Seattle, or Portland for that matter, to outvote the lunatics there.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like, if there has to be strategic retreats from certain cities, like a concession on those cities.
I think the more important
and the
thing
state
to
of
push
California
for,
as a whole.
I think the more important thing to push for is pushing out the leftists who move out of like California. Make your city as conservative and unwelcome to them as physically possible. Like in Florida, you pass these laws, they will run to the hills the second you can murder pedophiles.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of critical of my own state of Texas. Is a bill on like abortion because I did see it as too strict, and I did feel that like on certain issues it should be like legalized, like incest and rape. I do think that's the case. That should be the case. Like abortion should be illegal.
Well, I think most people would agree with that statement. It's not a it's not a radical idea for a woman not to raise the child of their rapist. That's not a radical statement.
But then I was like, maybe it's because my state has such a radical ban on abortion because they want to drive out the liberal population as much as possible. That's how I saw it. I was like, is this the start of something new where Florida's Governor Ron DeSantis and Governor Abbott in Texas, is that like their new strategy to consolidate like conservative power in the region? That is something to think about and to chew on.
Yes, I think that is a good way to look at it, because they simply will leave their, like, as things stand, there's more people in California than most states. But the way that the laws work to prevent the cities from ruling the countryside is to limit their power. And yes, some diehard people who believe in democracy might say that it's an obfuscation of it because the majority is not ruling. That's the whole reason it was made that way. It was made because the founding fathers didn't want the cities to dominate the countryside, which is a good thing. But these people simply, if you let them, will come into your towns and your cities and make them shitty. They will come into your towns talking about love and peace, and before you know it, there's riots, there's homelessness, extreme drug abuse, and you just fucking let it happen. I'm not saying go out and do something like violence. Don't go. I'm not telling you to do that. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but I'm not endorsing it. But make it as uncomfortable for them as possible. I cringe when I see Trump, posters, but fuck it. Put the biggest fucking Trump poster up. Make these people have trigger these people. Make it so every single time they leave their house, they have to record a video in their car screaming at TikTok because they saw a sign that offended them.
I've always seen American politics as kind of lowbrow, but in which I do see is pretty sad, but that's the point what we're at now,
It is. This is what you can do without resorting to violence. And that's really it. It's this or violence.
Which we always advocate for the peaceful means before violence, obviously.
Absolutely. I do not advocate people taking my advice and using it for violence.
Is there anything else you want to talk about? Because I think we covered everything.
I can't think of anything at the moment. Yeah, we can call that a wrap then.
Yeah.
Alright everybody, this has been Weaponized Radio, episode 2. We're hoping to make this more of a usual thing. We'll get a cast, I'm gonna try to get more people on so it can be like a round table discussion. So far I think the just back and forth is still nice, but we'll see what we can do.
Yeah. Thank you for having me on again, Goebbels. It's always fun.
Now, I know CSD isn't like a full-fledged fascist like I am, but he has a lot of good stuff to say, and yeah, we don't agree on everything, but that's the point, is to have an open dialogue. Before you head off, I'm going to go ahead and read the one comment we got on the last one. It's from Chief, just saying hello. I know Chief from Twitter, we're mutuals, and I respond, let's go. So, I plan on reading these out at the end of all these videos, so let me know if you have any feedback or just some stupid memes you want me to read. I'm recording this chunk post, so it's been 2 weeks since we recorded this. Information about Bakhmut has not changed as much, however the Ukrainian incursion into Russian territory has occurred since the time of this conversation, which we would have probably covered if I had been more timely with editing. But that could be for another episode. I have been Weaponized Goebbels, and this has been the second episode of Weaponized Radio, and I hope everyone listening has a wonderful night.
You came down to this southern town last summer to show the folks a brand new way of life. But all you've shown the folks around here is trouble, and you've only added misery to their strife. Your concern is not to help the people, and I'll say again, no, it's been often said. Your concern is just to bring discomfort, my friend, and your policy is just a little red. Now ain't I right? Ain't you right? Ain't you right? It matters not to you how people suffer, and should they, you consider that a gain. You bring a lot of trouble to the town and then you leave. That's part of your communistic game. I detect a little communism. I can see it in the things you do. Communism, socialism, call it what you like. There's very little difference in the two. Now ain't I right? Ain't you right? Your followers sometimes have been a bearded, bathless bunch. There's even been a minister or two, a priest, a nun, a rabbi, and an educated man have listened and been taken in by you. All the country's full of two-faced politicians who encourage you with words that go like this. Burn your draft card if you like, it's good to disagree. That's a get acquainted communistic kiss. Now ain't I right? Ain't you right? Ain't you right? One politician said it would be nice to send some blood and help the enemy in Vietnam. That's what he says, here's what I say, let's just keep the blood. Instead, let's send that politician man. Let's rid the country of the politicians who Coddle tramps that march out in our street, protesting those who want to fight for freedom, my friend. This kind of leader makes our country weak. Now ain't I right? Ain't it right? Ain't it right? Let's look and find the strong and able leaders. It's time we found just how our neighbors stand. If we're to win this war with communism, let's fight it here as well as Vietnam. Let's rise as one and meet our obligations, so communistic boots will never trod across the fields of freedom that were given to us with the blessing of our great almighty God. Across the fields of freedom that were given to us with a blessing